The image was delivered to my office on a Monday, arriving by a special courier service from the archives of Piton College. This was a small liberal arts school in Massachusetts that had ceased operations back in 1967. The college's entire collection of documents was in the process of being digitized before its final transfer to the state's Historical Society, and the archivist had singled out this specific picture as being unusual, wanting an expert to take a look. My profession is that of a photographic historian, focusing on verifying and studying pictures from the early 1900s, so examining odd images was a regular part of my job. However, the moment I slid the picture from its protective sleeve and gazed upon it, a distinct chill traveled up my back. The photograph depicted what seemed to be a university lecture hall, most likely dating from around 1904, judging by the fashions and the method used to take the picture. About 40 young men were seated in ascending rows of wooden chairs equipped with flip-top desks, all of them dressed in the dark, formal suits common for the period. Most held papers or textbooks in their hands. A handful of additional men were standing at the room's rear. 2 generous windows on the left wall allowed a flood of daylight to enter the scene. It appeared to be a perfectly standard class portrait until your attention was drawn to one specific pupil. In the third row, positioned just a little to the left of the middle, a young man in a dark suit was sitting. His stance was unremarkable. His hands were resting neatly on the desktop in front of him, just like his classmates. But in the place where his head ought to have been, there was simply nothing. It was not a smudge, not a darkness, not a blank spot. His shirt collar simply terminated, and above it, the wall behind him was perfectly visible, as if his head had never been there at all. The result was so perfectly integrated that my first assumption was of an intentional trick, maybe done as a prank or to show off a technical skill. Yet, when I studied the picture under a magnifying lens, I could find no signs of alteration. The photographic emulsion was consistent and unbroken across the zone where the head should have appeared. There were no indicators of a double exposure, no physical cutting and pasting, no signs of hand painting. This seemed to be one single, untouched photographic exposure showing a classroom of students, one of whom had, for some inexplicable reason, been captured without a head. I telephoned the archivist at Piton College. Her name was Dr. Sarah Brennan, and she had spent the last 2 years organizing the college's photo archive. "I was hoping you would call," she said as soon as I introduced myself. "That picture has been disturbing my sleep. Have you determined what is the matter with it?" "I can verify it is not a doctored image," I told her, "but I cannot account for the irregularity." "Do you have any background details for it?" she replied. "The photograph has a label that reads, Philosophy 301, Professor Whitmore, Spring 1904. I located an old course catalogue from that year which lists a Professor Edmund Whitmore as the instructor for an advanced philosophy seminar. There is also a class list with 38 names, though I see more people than that in the picture. 38 students, but you count more in the photograph? I asked. "Correct," she said. 42, by my tally, and that includes the one who is missing his head. I looked at the image again, counting each figure meticulously. She was right. 42 men were visible, even though the official register only listed 38. "Is there any writing on the photograph itself?" I inquired. "Anything on the reverse or on the mat?" "Nothing on the front," she answered. "But on the back, someone wrote in pencil, Spring 1904. "Remember him." "Remember him?" I repeated. "Just those 2 words," she confirmed. "Dr. Brennan?" I asked, "Are you able to retrieve any student files from that 1904 period? Anything like obituaries, records of disciplinary actions, or other unusual occurrences?" "I have been conducting a search myself. There is a noticeable absence in the archives. A number of files from the spring of 1904 are simply gone. However, I did uncover one item." She paused for a moment. It was an obituary published in the university's newspaper from May of 1904. It states that Thomas Aldrich, a senior set to graduate that year, passed away unexpectedly on March 28th. The listed cause was an accident. His funeral service was conducted on the college grounds, and it was attended by the whole senior class. Thomas Aldrich. I repeated, jotting down the name. Was he enrolled in Professor Whitmore's philosophy seminar? I cannot say for certain, she admitted. As I mentioned, several record folders are unaccounted for. But there is another detail. The memorial notice includes a statement from Professor Whitmore himself. He is quoted as saying, "Thomas was a brilliant scholar whose absence is mourned by everyone who knew him. He approached the profound mysteries of life with an intrepid intellect. It is a profound misfortune that he will not cross the stage to receive his diploma alongside his peers. An intrepid intellect. Profound mysteries of life." The phrasing was striking, unusually formal even for the time. "Have you located any other portraits from that era that include Thomas Aldrich?" I inquired. "I have been looking, but I have not had any success so far," she replied. "It is possible his picture is in the 1904 yearbook, but that specific volume is missing from our archives." After our conversation concluded, I returned my attention to the photograph. The student without a head was seated in a relaxed, natural position, his physique clearly defined and solid, his hands resting in a normal way. The surface of his desk, like those of the other students, was scattered with papers. The young men seated adjacent to him exhibited no response to his extraordinary state. They were all looking directly at the camera, their expressions ordinary, as if everything was perfectly normal. I used digital tools to enlarge various segments of the picture, scrutinizing the space where the student's head ought to be. The wall in the background was completely visible, displaying the identical surface pattern and consistency as the wall seen elsewhere in the image. There was no faint residual image, no subtle contour, no hint that a head had ever occupied that space and had later been removed. It was as if the young man had never possessed a head, as if he had posed for this group picture as a headless form, and not a single person had taken notice or found it remarkable. I managed to locate further details about Thomas Aldrich through genealogical websites and historical newspaper records. He had been born in 1882 inches Worcester, Massachusetts. He had attended Petton College on an academic scholarship, focusing his studies on philosophy and the classics. He had been considered one of the most gifted minds in his graduating year, and his life ended on March 28, 1904. He was 21 years old. The Worcester Telegram had published a short piece on the incident. College student dies in tragic mishap. Thomas Aldrich, a senior at Petton College, died yesterday evening in what officials are describing as a tragic accident. According to college authorities, Aldrich was discovered in the chemistry laboratory, having sustained grave injuries. Dr. Edmund Whitmore, who was Aldrich's philosophy professor, found the young man and called for assistance, but Aldrich was declared deceased at the location. The specific nature of the injuries and the exact sequence of events leading to the accident have not been made public. Aldrich was recognized as a distinguished student with a bright future ahead of him. He is survived by his parents and two sisters. Grave injuries, nature not disclosed, found in the chemistry laboratory, I repeated to myself. I attempted to locate more specific information, but my search yielded nothing further. The entire event appeared to have been quietly suppressed, with no record of a formal inquiry and no subsequent articles in the press. I returned to the photograph, now examining it with a completely new perspective. If this headless figure was indeed Thomas Aldrich, then this image had to have been captured at some point during the spring term of 1904, before his death on March 28th. Unless, of course, it had been taken after that date. I called Dr. Brennan once more. "Do you possess any documentation that confirms the precise date this picture was taken?" "Nothing definitive," she answered, "but I did uncover something of interest. The ledger for the college photographer indicates he received payment for a series of classroom portraits on the 15th of April 1904. A cold dread settled in my stomach. That is over 2 weeks after Thomas Aldrich died. It would seem the photograph was taken after his death, she confirmed, her voice low. And there is another detail. I discovered Professor Whitmore's personal journal among a collection of his private papers that were donated to the archive after he passed. He maintained meticulous daily records. For the 15th of April 1904, he wrote, "Had the class photographed today, all present as promised. Even Thomas kept his word, though it cost him dearly. The students suspect nothing. They see only what they expect to see. Even Thomas kept his word, I echoed. But he was deceased. I am aware, she said. Yet Whitmore wrote as if Aldrich had been physically present, as if he had actively taken part in the group portrait. She hesitated before continuing. There is more context. Earlier entries from March describe Whitmore's philosophy seminar as delving into the frontiers, separating the physical from the non-physical. He wrote that Aldrich had developed a fixation on the question of whether awareness could continue after the body had perished. A profound chill ran through me. Well, what became of Professor Whitmore? He continued his teaching duties until 1910. Then he resigned abruptly. He relocated to New York and passed away in 1923. But I found one final item among his personal documents, she said. It was a letter he wrote to a fellow academic in 1909, reflecting on his time at Penn. He referenced the Spring 1904 seminar and wrote, "I believed then that we were engaged in purely theoretical philosophical debate. I did not realize until it was too late that Thomas had interpreted our discussions as a literal guide rather than abstract thought. What he did was not my fault. Yet I will carry the burden of this guilt until my final day." "What did Thomas Aldrich do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I do not know for certain," she replied, "but I suspect it is connected to the manner of his death. Severe injuries in the chemistry laboratory, and Whitmore's note that Thomas kept his word, though it cost him dearly." I dedicated the following week to investigating every available resource concerning Penn College from the spring of 1904. I learned that Professor Whitmore's advanced philosophy seminar had been concentrated on themes of consciousness, selfhood, and the connection between the mind and the physical form. Whitmore had been deeply interested in spiritualism and early paranormal research, and it seemed he had prompted his students to investigate these subjects through practical experimentation. I managed to locate a student diary from one of Aldrich's peers, preserved by his descendants, and later scanned for a digital archive. The entries from March 1904 were deeply revealing. March 10. Thomas has become utterly consumed by his research project. He claims to have found a method to prove that the conscious mind exists independently of the physical vessel. Professor Whitmore actively encourages his fervor. Efforts. Although a few of us are concerned, Thomas is approaching the matter with excessive seriousness. March 20. Thomas revealed his preparations to us. He is absolutely convinced that if he can successfully detach consciousness from its physical shell, he will prove the mind's supreme authority. He announced he would give a demonstration for us after the spring recess. March 29. Dreadful news. Thomas is dead. The official story is a mishap in the chemistry lab, but I am aware of what he was trying to accomplish. He confided in me just the day before. He told me he would validate his theory by surpassing physical constraints. I am terrified he managed to succeed in a manner none of us could have foreseen. Thomas Aldrich had tried to validate philosophical concepts through dangerous self-experimentation. He had endeavored to demonstrate that human awareness could persist without a physical vessel, and in some way he had succeeded, or at the very 17. Least, he had persuaded himself he would. The undisclosed nature of his catastrophic injuries now formed a horrifying picture. If he had been discovered in the chemistry laboratory with grievous wounds, if his goal had been the liberation of consciousness from bodily form, I did not want to contemplate what specific actions he might have taken, but the photograph provided its own grim testimony. It was captured over a fortnight after Aldrich's death. It depicted Professor Whitmore's philosophy class. There were 38 living students, as per the official list, and 4 additional figures, including one lacking a head, seated tranquilly in the 3rd row, present for the portrait as promised. Thomas had kept his word. He had been there for the class picture, even after death. But something had been imperfect. The photograph had recorded his presence, but not fully. His body was captured, solid and tangible, but his head, the vessel of consciousness, the home of the brain, and the mind upon which he had been so fixated was missing, invisible, gone. Had he truly managed to separate his consciousness from his physical self? Had he transcended the limits of the body? Or had he merely destroyed himself in a philosophical exercise that ended in catastrophe? Professor Whitmore had written that the students suspected nothing, that they saw only what they expected to see. The living students seated beside Aldrich's headless form had not detected anything out of order. They had posed for the photograph, assuming every person present was alive and intact, and the camera had imprinted the reality their senses could not register. I magnified the image one final time, studying the countenances of the pupils seated closest to the headless entity. Most gazed normally toward the camera, their faces wearing the standard formal expressions of the era. But one young man, positioned directly behind the headless form, wore a look that was distinctly different. His eyes were wide, his complexion ashen, and he seemed to be staring not at the lens, but downward, at the figure in front of him, as if he could perceive something the others could not. I located his name on the class register, Michael Brennan, aged 22. After his graduation, he had worked briefly as an educator, but he left that post after only 2 years. Medical files noted he received treatment for nervous exhaustion in 1906 and convalesced in a sanitarium. He died in 1915, having never married or built a professional life. The student who had sat behind Thomas Aldrich's headless form had been shattered by what he had witnessed. The photograph now resides in the archives of the Massachusetts Historical Society, correctly conserved and catalogued. The description card mounted beside it reads, Philosophy 301, Professor Edmund Whitmore, Peton College, Spring, 1904. An anomalous photographic print depicting a class portrait with an unexplained visual irregularity. The official explanation for the irregularity remains undetermined, though it is noted that it coincides with the passing of a student, Thomas Aldrich, who died in March of 1904 inches, what was officially described as a laboratory mishap. The placard does not mention that the photographic session occurred after Aldrich's death. It does not reveal that he appears in the picture as a figure without a head. It makes no reference to Professor Whitmore's philosophical explorations or Thomas Aldrich's attempt to validate theories concerning consciousness through a fatal act of self-experimentation. But those of us who have scrutinized the image understand the reality. Thomas Aldrich died on March 28, 1904, in a tragic endeavor to demonstrate that human awareness could persist independently of its physical vessel. 2.5 weeks later, he manifested in his philosophy class portrait, honoring a promise made to Professor Whitmore and his fellow students. Yet, the photograph captured only a fragment of his being. His body materialized, solid and tangible, seated at a desk just like the living pupils surrounding him. But his head, his consciousness, his mind, the very part of himself he had striven to liberate from physical constraint, was absent, invisible, transcended, or perhaps merely annihilated. The photograph does not deceive. It reveals what was present on April 15, 1904, when Professor Whitmore's philosophy class gathered for their formal picture. 38 living students and Thomas Aldrich, deceased for over a fortnight, present as pledged, yet unfinished. A body without a head, a material form devoid of consciousness. Proof, perhaps, that he had achieved his goal, or proof that he had failed disastrously, severing his mind from his body in a manner that left him suspended between being and nothingness, perceptible to the camera's lens, yet not entirely there, incapable of being made whole again. The photograph preserves that impossible instant, a class, portrait that incorporates the deceased, a student who honored his commitment even after death, a young man who desired so desperately to prove philosophical abstractions that he obliterated himself in the process. And now, more than a century later, he remains seated in that third row for all eternity, headless, unfinished, present, but not complete. A cautionary tale about the perils of pursuing ideas to their absolute extreme, about the price of attempting to surpass human limitations, about the consequences that unfold when theoretical philosophy transforms into a lethal practice. Thomas Aldrich sits in that classroom still, without his head, without his mind, present in body alone. This is precisely the opposite of what he had sought to demonstrate. The photograph reveals it all. The truth that the living students were unable to perceive. The reality that Professor Whitmore was forced to carry for the remainder of his guilt-ridden existence. One student is missing his head, And now we understand the reason. Because he attempted to prove his consciousness could exist without it, and perhaps he succeeded, or perhaps he failed, or perhaps, in some terrible way, he accomplished both. The photograph endures. The mystery persists. And Thomas Aldridge sits, headless, in that university lecture hall, suspended in the year 1904, forever in attendance, forever unfinished, forever evidence that some inquiries should never be pursued through experimentation, some frontiers should never be breached, some truths ought to remain theoretical, and some photographs reveal to us far more than we ever wished to see.